Okay, so today I'm going to present my dissertation research, and I'm interested in labor politics in authoritarian China, in particular the labor law and the enforcement of labor laws and regulations in post-reform China. So China's labor relations have undergone drastic transformation over the last few decades. Before, the Chinese workers, they were seen as the master of workplace. They were the privileged class, the ones that received the so-called iron rice bowl, the lifelong employment, security, and welfare. But since China adopted market reforms, workers became the losers of this process. They lost their security, their employment, and they saw their working conditions and rights deteriorated. And critics indeed have called China as the world's largest sweatshop. And they blamed China's labor unions as a main factor, a main reason behind this deteriorating labor rights and working conditions. And this is because in China, all labor unions are part of an umbrella trade union organization called the All China Federation of Trade Unions. The ACFTU is tightly controlled by the ruling Chinese Communist Party. In China, alternative unions are not allowed to exist. So critics, when they see Chinese labor unions, they say, Chinese unions are not relevant. They can't help the Chinese workers improve their working conditions because they are controlled by the CCP. They are not autonomous. So I became interested in this topic. I wonder, if there's any change. And when I look into this topic, I found there's some interesting pattern. So here I have a graph that shows the trend of labor protection since 2003. So this is the data from 2003 to 2008. And I'm using inspection by the labor bureaus as a proxy, because inspection by the labor bureaus in China, they cover a set of minimum labor standards. So I use that as a way to measure labor protection. And if you look at this graph, it shows a gradual increase of inspection, labor protection. So the left-hand sidebar, the blue bar, represents the percentage of enterprises inspected. The right-hand sidebar, the red bar, represents the raw number, the number of enterprises. So regardless of which side you're looking at, you see this gradual increase of labor protection. This is very interesting because that contradicts the pictures that, or the stories that we've been hearing that in China, we see a lot of labor rights violations, workers are experiencing really bad conditions, etc. So if there's a variation across time on the national level, what about the local level? What about if there's any patterns across Chinese provinces? And here, I found that yes, there is a variation across Chinese provinces. Again, I use the inspection rate as a measure for labor protection. And you can see that this shows that in some Chinese provinces, we see a higher level of labor protection than other provinces. This is very interesting and very puzzling because it's what explains this variation. Why do we see some provinces having a higher level of labor protection while other provinces having a lower level of labor protection? So here's my argument. I argue that labor conflicts act as a catalyst of those variation and those changes. I argue that, again, I'm in my dissertation, I look at both the national and the local level, but here I'm going to focus on the local level. So at the local level, rising labor conflicts induced the party leadership at the local level to enact pro-labor measures. And this is because labor conflicts make the local leadership worried. They're worried about labor conflicts posing risk to social stability. And why do they worry about social instability? Because social instability poses risk to their political rule. So social instability affects political instability. So when they see more labor conflicts, local leadership got worried and they decide to put more emphasis on labor protection. And they do so, one of their means to achieve social stability, to prevent labor unrest, is the labor unions. What they do is they empower the labor unions. In this context, they give the labor unions more authority to act as fire alarms. And this term, fire alarms, is used by political scientists McCubbins and Schwartz. It is referring to a type of monitoring mechanism. So in this context, labor unions, when they act as fire alarms, they can detect signs of labor conflicts, labor unrest. And when they detect signs of labor conflicts, they can notify the labor bureaus. The labor bureaus are the ones that are in charge of enforcing labor standards, implementing labor policies. So the labor unions, they can notify, alert the labor bureaus, there's some problems, we need to solve this, and labor bureaus can jump in and resolve the disputes before they erupt into a larger scale collective actions. So from this argument, I derived my first hypothesis, which is that labor conflicts are positively associated with union empowerment, union authority, this authority to act as fire alarms. My second part of the argument has to do with union empowerment. Now that union has this authority to act as fire alarm, they can induce the labor bureaucracies to put more efforts to enforce the legal labor standards. So from this, I derived my second hypothesis. Union monetary authority is positively associated with the enforcement efforts of labor standards by the labor bureaucracies. So the question is, why do local governments not enforce labor laws? If there exist labor laws and labor regulations, why don't they enforce them in the first place? Why do they have to wait until rising labor conflicts to react? And to answer this, we have to take a quick look at the major actors and their preference in Chinese labor politics. So on the top, one of the key actors is the CCP. The party at the central level is responsible for overseeing labor relations, managing labor relations, and as I said, the key objective for the party since market reforms is social stability. For the reason that if there's signs and trends of instability, there is a possibility of political instability. Now that the CCP takes this role as the overseer, the manager of labor relations, it needs help from its agents because China is a big country. So one of the key agents that the CCP at the central level relies on is the local governments. The local governments are responsible for implementing the labor policies passed by the center. The problem with the local government is that the local governments are the so-called multitask bureaucrats, meaning that they are in charge of several policy objectives. And one of the key policy objectives they are responsible over is economic growth and development. So the goal of economic development growth is in conflict with the goal of social stability. Because in order to fulfill economic growth, local governments have to attract investment and business. Investors and business and managers, they want an environment where there's less regulation and where labor cost is low. That is against this goal of labor protection, right? Because if you address the demands of the workers, you have to grant them more protection. That increases the cost of labor. And in the end, local governments then they tend to meet the goal of economic growth. They tend to meet the demands of the investors and the business and the manager and sacrifice the interests of the workers and the goal of social stability. So as you can see, there is a divergence of policy interest. At the central level, the center wants social stability and it wants those policies to be implemented. But the local governments, they have other policy objectives in mind. So they tend not to implement the policy, they tend not to enforce the legal labor standards. And also at the local level, the local governments are controlling the labor bureaus and the local governments, the local labor unions. So those two actors, the agents that are in charge of enforcing labor standards, they lack the necessary resources and the supports to do so. That's why we see inadequate enforcement of labor standards, inadequate labor protection. Another key actor in this picture is the ACFTU and the labor unions. They are what I would call the single task bureaucrat, the single task agent. Their job is to help the party stabilize labor relations, to prevent labor unrest from challenging the rule of the party. The problem with the ACFTU and the labor unions is that they lack the power. They don't have the necessary authority to implement their policy. And my research found out that throughout most of the PRC history, the ACFTU, despite their role as the only legal union organization in China, they lack political clout. They were often marginalized from the labor policy making process. So here, the problem with the ACFTU, again, is lack of power. Here is just an organizational chart illustrating the key actors in Chinese labor politics and their relationship with each other. Okay, so to test my hypotheses, I have a couple research designs, but here I'm going to focus on my quantitative analyses. So in my quantitative analyses, I have two separate analyses, one on each hypothesis. And to test my hypotheses, I went through a variety of statistical resources, yearbooks on the national level, provincial level yearbooks, even provincial statistical reports to compile this data set to test the relationship between labor conflicts, union empowerment, and the enforcement of labor laws and regulations. And I believe that my research is one of the first to look at this topic on a systematic fashion. So far, I haven't recalled any other research projects that come up with this kind of data set to test the relationship. Here's the layout for my first analysis. So I use an ordinary least square model, and I look at the data between 2003 and 2008. I use a cross-sectional change between 2003 and 2008, meaning that I'm looking at the difference between the two end years. And I do that because I argue that the effect of labor conflicts on union empowerment is not an immediate one. In other words, it takes time for the party leadership at the local level to react to labor conflicts. It's unlikely for them to see a rising labor conflicts at year one, and they jump in and then they react to that. And once they decide to empower the unions, it also takes time for the unions to institute this change. For my dependent variable, I'm looking at, again, union empowerment. So I pick four measures, four types of union legal institutions to capture this sense of unions as the fire alarms. And you can tell that from the description of those four legal union institutions that they give unions this power, this capacity to detect signs of labor conflicts and to notify the labor bureaus or even the local governments, the local party leadership, so they could resolve the labor disputes. And here is my independent variable. I chose labor disputes as a measure for labor conflict. And these are disputes that are brought forth by the workers and sometimes the employers. They will bring their complaints to the local labor bureaus and ask them to resolve the complaints. So here I have the result for my first analysis. And we can look at this role on dispute. In all four except for legal aid, the relationship is positive and significant. This means that when you see more disputes, you see more legal institutions, the union legal institutions. Increase in the labor dispute file leads to increase or is associated with the increase in union legal institutions. Here, the relationship between the two variables is positive but not significant. And I suspect that has to do with the nature of this union legal institution. So union legal clinics, the provision of union legal service consultation might be more of an ad hoc firefighting measure than fire alarm measure. Because when workers, they bring their grievance or they go to the union legal clinics for consultation, they probably already made up their mind that they are going to proceed with the complaints and go into the dispute settlement mechanism. Here is a chart showing the predicted effects of labor conflicts on union authority. Again, you can see that the relationship between the two variables is positive. So this just means that if you go from a lower level of labor disputes to a higher level of labor disputes, the predicted value of Y, which is the union legal institution, in this case, I use the example of the union labor law and prevention units. The predicted value goes up. So here I have the layout for my second analysis. I'm looking at the relationship between union empowerment, union strength, and the enforcement of labor standards. I used a similar setup, except that I'm looking at the change from year to year. So I have 186 number of observations. For my dependent variable, I look at on-site inspection, the percentage of enterprises that are inspected by the labor bureaus. For my independent variable, again, I chose those 4 types of union legal institutions, but here they're expressed in terms of percentage. So the percentage of union branches with labor alarm prevention unit, union legal aid clinics, etc. Okay, so here's the result for my second analysis. If you look at those 4 cells, you can find out the relationship between the two variables is, again, positive and significant. This means that when there's more union legal institutions, you see more inspection. Again, here's the chart on the predicted effects of union authority on labor law enforcement, showing positive relationship between the two variables. When you go from a lower level of unions with the labor alarm prevention units to a higher level of it, the predicted value goes up. So to recap my research findings, I find that labor conflicts are positively associated with union empowerment. And my second analysis shows that union empowerment is associated with more enforcement of legal labor standards. So I drew a couple implications from my research. First is that a positive development of labor relations, pro-labor developments could occur in authoritarian contexts like China's. In China's case, local party leaders, they react to the demands of the workers when they see rising labor conflicts. They're worried that labor conflicts will pose a risk to social stability and their political rule. Also, I found that authoritarian rulers, they could design measures to ensure the accountability of their agents. So in China's case, again, to recall that the problem with inadequate labor law enforcement is this divergence of policy preference between the center and the localities. Right? The centers want the laws and the regulations to be enforced, but the local governments, they don't comply because they have more interest in economic growth and development. So in response, the center designs measures, and one of the measures they do is to empower the unions, to empower the single task bureaucrats so the unions could help the party to, I wouldn't say monitor, but to notify the labor bureaus, the local governments, so they can do their job. to prevent labor unrest. And by implication, this shows the resilience of authoritarian systems. When authoritarian rulers like China see pressures from below, they can come up with measures to ensure their political survival. And the last implication has to do with the issue of globalization and labor standards. So there are some critics that argue that China is an unlikely candidate for positive pro-labor developments. And to see improvement in labor standards in places like China, there needs to be external pressures from the foreign governments or from the NGOs, even the multinationals themselves. But my research shows that changes could come from within China. Authoritarian rulers like the CCP can be induced to enact pro-labor measures. And instead of attacking or vilifying the ACFTU and the labor unions, my research suggests that the labor unions, the NGOs around the world, even the foreign governments, they could try to work with the ACFTU to help the ACFTU and the labor unions to improve labor standards in China. So with that said, here's my talk, and I thank you for coming to listen to me. And now I turn the table to Derek. He's going to present his research. Thank you.